This week in our crossover to Germany, the country takes over the rotating presidency of the EU and the rotating presidency of the United Nations Security Council. Germany is expected in this position to lead EU efforts to recover from the coronavirus crisis and also lead the EU's new relationship with Brexit Britain. But what do all these mean and what are the implications? Political correspondent Thomas Sparrow joins me with more from Berlin. Thomas, it's good to have you. It's been a while. Now, please tell us, give us the update on the coronavirus cases in Germany now, following the renewal of lockdown in the western parts of the country.
It has been a while, Gifty, but it's always a pleasure to be back with you and your team to talk about the situation here in Germany, the general situation also in Europe. If you specifically look at the numbers here in Germany, the coronavirus numbers, you will see that Germany is closing in on 200,000 confirmed cases of coronavirus. But that is only one aspect of it all, because if you look, for example, at how many people have recovered, then you will see that a vast majority of those people have now recovered. So you only have a very small portion of active cases here in the country. This has led authorities in the past few weeks, in the past few months, to gradually open the country. And as you mentioned correctly in your question, there have been specific cases, specific outbreaks, like the one that you discussed, I think, last week or a few weeks ago in the meat processing plant in the western part of the country, that made authorities make the decision that a regional or a local lockdown had to be implemented. Again, the goal behind all of these measures is to try and avoid general lockdowns, to try and make sure that if there is an outbreak in a specific place, in a specific region or in a specific sector, that those outbreaks can be managed locally, or if it gets even bigger, then regionally, but under no circumstance nationally. So that's the general situation here in Germany. Now, that specific case in the western part of the country is one that has been bothering authorities, one that has been worrying authorities, and that's why they have been trying to deal with this in a local or regional way by isolating, by imposing that lockdown that they did a few weeks ago on the specific areas that are affected. It still remains an important issue here. It still remains a controversial issue, because we're not only talking about coronavirus numbers, we're talking about the very difficult situation in the meat processing industry, where many of the people working there come from Eastern Europe, where they come under subcontracts, where they have to live in very difficult conditions. So you'll certainly hear more from Germany and from changes in the meat industry in the next few weeks and months.
We look forward to that. But let's now take a focus to the EU presidency and the UN Security Council. Fill us in on what's about to happen.
So it's rotating. So obviously every 6 months at the EU, one country takes over the EU Council, and as such it has to lead some of the efforts that the EU is carrying, or is at least dealing with in that specific time. It's important now because obviously this time is very challenging, not only for Europe but also for the rest of the world. Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, for example, said that the coronavirus was the biggest challenge that the EU has faced in its history. And one of the key elements of that recovery will be the economic recovery from this crisis. So it's very important that the EU's biggest economy takes the helm of the EU when it comes to trying to solve this particular case, this recovery on an economic perspective in the EU. There is a proposal on the table from Germany and France, a massive proposal for the EU to recover economically. This is also something that's being supported by the EU Commission, and as such, that's something that German Chancellor, when she's leading these efforts, will have to also try and make sure that it's implemented in one way or another. There is some resistance from other countries. So, for example, some of the countries that are described as frugal countries, the Netherlands, Austria, Sweden, those are three, for example, countries that are described as frugal countries. They have opposed the idea of sharing debt at a European level. They want loans to be issued instead. So it will be a very difficult challenge for Angela Merkel to try and convince the other countries that it is necessary to have this EU recovery plan based, at least in part, on sharing debt at an EU level. This is not the only element, by the way. We have Brexit as well. We've discussed Brexit, Gifty, various times here in this program, and it's now sort of a key moment to try and see what the future relationship will be like between the EU and the UK. It's stumbled, it's been difficult, it's been tricky, and it's been tricky also in the last few weeks when you have the coronavirus overwhelming, or at least not allowing all these issues to be discussed appropriately. In the next few months, it'll be absolutely essential to decide what the future relationship will be from a political perspective, but more importantly also from an economic perspective, from a trade perspective. So this also falls under the German-EU rotating presidency.
And speaking of the presidency, specifically what is expected, you've given us the background of, what to look out for, what people are looking out for. But when it comes to Germany at the helm of affairs, how is it expected specifically to respond to this pandemic in the face of all the background that you've given us?
So what happens when a country leads the EU Council? It then leads or at least chairs some of the meetings that are being discussed on particular issues. And that is something that will be very important in this particular case, because when we're talking about such challenges, very big challenges in an EU perspective, then these are also elements that have to be coordinated, because many decisions at the EU level are made by all 27 countries. In other words, all 27 countries have to be on board for a particular decision to be implemented. And this is why it's so necessary to have all those long discussions where all the different interests of the 27 countries are put into one sort of proposal, which is then approved and which is then implemented. Angela Merkel is well known for her sort of backroom negotiations, where she spends hours and hours talking to different EU leaders to try and get a compromise. That's something that she's well known for at a European level, and that will certainly come in handy in the next few months when it comes to deciding on that EU recovery package. It's a very big package, one that will be specifically implemented to try and help some of the countries hardest hit by the pandemic, some of the sectors hardest hit by the pandemic, and as such try and make sure that Europe can recover economically from this very difficult situation.
And what are the implications? I mean, getting it wrong, getting it right, the interventions that you'll put in, all of these come with implications. And knowing that Angela Merkel herself has been pro-Afrocentric, if you ask me, what sort of implications are we looking at here in the face of all these facts? So
there's obviously a political implication here. Germany has a lot of pressure now as the EU's biggest economy, as one of Europe's most important countries, to try and deliver. So it's not only about words and good projects, it's about delivering that, specifically when you have high unemployment, when you have a recession, when you have economic troubles, when you have a pandemic. So basically it is about delivering. There is a sort of idea that if the EU's biggest economy can't deliver, then who could actually deliver? Who could actually lead the EU to try and resolve these very, very big issues? They've been described even as existential issues for the EU. So on the one hand, there's a political implication there, but obviously when you look at Angela Merkel herself, it's also about her legacy. This is seen as Angela Merkel's last chance before she leaves office in 2021, so next year, to try and cement her legacy at a European level. Angela Merkel has been through many crises at the European level in her 15 years in office. Just for example, the financial crisis, the migration crisis, and now the coronavirus crisis. Her legacy is certainly ambivalent, so there are those who criticize that legacy, who view it rather negatively. There are those who say that she, as one of the most important politicians, if not the most important politician in Europe, has reshaped Europe in a very specific way. So there are critics, there are those who praise her as well, but this is certainly a chance for her to cement that legacy. In other words, what she actually achieves in the next few months will certainly be key to try and understand how that legacy is viewed once Angela Merkel leaves office next year here in Germany.